The strangest thing about Dolly Parton's last days is that she wasn't saying goodbye. She was making plans. Only 4 days before her death, she was talking about the things she still wanted to accomplish. She was still working, still creating, still looking ahead. Then she died. And almost immediately, people began digging through her old interviews and discovering something deeply unsettling. For more than 2 decades, Dolly had been talking about death in a way that most people simply dismissed as another part of her humor. She had even described the exact kind of ending she wanted. She didn't want to retire. She wanted to keep working. And she once said she hoped she would fall dead in the middle of some great event or some great song she was singing. When she said it, people laughed. Nobody thought much of it. But after August 25, 2026, that old recording became impossible to hear the same way. Because Dolly Parton was 80 years old when she died, and suddenly, one of the most famous jokes she'd ever made about death sounded less like a joke and more like a strange piece of foreshadowing. The important thing is that she did not predict her death. There is no evidence that Dolly knew she would die in 2026. What makes this story frightening is something much more realistic. She had spent years preparing for a world that would eventually exist without her. And the preparations were unusually specific. Long before her death, Dolly had already thought about what would happen to her music after she was gone. She had recorded songs that had never been released. She had talked about leaving enough material behind so other people could continue working with her voice after her death. She understood that technology would change. She understood that she wouldn't always be there to supervise her own music. So she planned for it. That alone isn't strange. Many famous musicians leave behind unreleased recordings. But Dolly took the idea much further. She wanted her voice to continue existing after she was gone. She wanted future producers to have enough material to create songs using recordings she'd made while alive. It was as if she were building a version of herself that could continue making music after she couldn't. And then there was the locked box. At Dollywood's Dreammore Resort in Tennessee, Dolly had placed a recording inside a wooden box. The song was called My Place in History. She had written and recorded it in 2015. The plan was that nobody would hear it until her 100th birthday in 2046. She even included a CD player because she worried that technology might change so much that future generations would not have an easy way to play the recording. Imagine that. A woman standing inside a recording studio, creating a song for a date 20 years in the future that she might never live to see. The song was intentionally sealed away. Dolly knew the rules. She knew that once the box was closed, she wasn't supposed to open it. She had essentially created a message from her living self to her future self. But now there is something nobody could have known when she recorded it. Dolly will never be there when that box is opened. She will not hear the song on her 100th birthday. She won't know what people think of it. She won't be around to explain the lyrics. The recording will be there. She won't. That is a very different kind of haunting. Because it isn't supernatural. It's a real object. A real song. A real recording. Made by a real person who is now gone. And the strangest part is that Dolly had always been unusually comfortable with this idea. She talked about death openly. She talked about faith. She talked about heaven. She talked about what would happen to her songs. She talked about her funeral. In a 2014 interview, Dolly was asked what song she would want played when she died. Most people would probably have expected, I Will Always Love You. Instead, she chose the gospel hymn, If We Never Meet Again. The song had special meaning because it was her father's favorite and had been performed at his funeral. She already knew what she wanted people to hear when they gathered to say goodbye. Again, there is nothing supernatural about that. People make funeral plans every day. But with Dolly, there was a pattern. She didn't just acknowledge that death existed. She repeatedly thought about what would remain after she was gone. The songs, the recordings, the funeral, the memories, the faith, the legacy. And then, years later, she lost her husband. Carl Dean died in March 2025 after nearly 60 years of marriage. Dolly had always protected their private life. Carl rarely appeared in public. Their relationship had existed largely away from cameras and headlines. After his death, Dolly continued working. But she later acknowledged that while caring for Carl, she had not paid enough attention to herself. That detail would become extremely important, because by 2026, Dolly's health had begun to change. She had to miss public appearances. She sometimes appeared through video instead of traveling. She had been dealing with dizziness and dehydration. She was also postponing or adjusting public plans. Yet she kept talking about work. She kept looking forward. She kept acting like there was still time. Then came August. On August 19th, she accepted an award virtually. Instead of simply saying she couldn't attend because she wasn't feeling well, she spoke about what she was still doing. She talked about songwriting. She talked about upcoming projects. She talked about the future. She sounded like Dolly. Positive, funny, busy, still working. 4 days later, she gave an even more direct health update. On August 21st, Dolly told people that she had been dealing with health problems she had neglected while taking care of Carl. She admitted that she had been putting things off, but there was one sentence that would become difficult to hear after what happened next. She said she still had so many things she wanted to achieve. That statement was published on August 21st. On the same day, she was hospitalized. 4 days later, she was dead. Dolly Parton died on August 25th, 2026, in Nashville. Her family announced the death that day. Her team later confirmed that she had been battling cancer. She was 80. The woman who had spent her entire career convincing people that there was always another song, another project, another performance, another plan, was suddenly gone. And this is where the story becomes genuinely eerie. Go back to that old interview. Dolly is talking about retirement. She says she will never retire. She says she wants to keep touring when she's 100. And then she says she hopes to fall dead while doing something she loves. At the time, it's funny. It sounds like an extension of her personality. She is joking about old age. She's joking about the fact that she refuses to slow down. But there is something else buried inside the joke. She was describing the kind of death she wanted, not a long goodbye. Not years of being unable to work, not sitting around waiting for the end. She wanted to keep creating. She wanted to remain herself until the end. And that's exactly what makes her final days so strange. She didn't know she was about to die. At least, nothing credible shows that she did. Only 4 days before her death, she was still talking about the future. There were still things she wanted to accomplish. That means the ending wasn't something she had publicly accepted as imminent. It arrived while she was still planning, still working, still healing, still thinking ahead. And that is much more realistic than a supernatural prediction, because most people don't know when their final day is. They make plans for next month. They buy things for next year. They start projects they won't finish. They assume there will be time. Dolly did the same thing, except she had been thinking about the end for decades. She knew that someday she would disappear, so she tried to make sure her work wouldn't. That's why the "My Place in History" recording is such a powerful detail. The song was made years before her death. She put it away. She sealed it. She chose a future date. And now, when that box is eventually opened, the person who made the recording will have been dead for years. Think about what that moment will feel like. Someone opens the box. They press play. Dolly's voice comes through the speakers. She may be singing about the future. She may be talking about where she thinks she belongs in history. She may be joking. She may sound exactly like she did when she recorded it. And for a few minutes, it will feel like she's still alive. But she won't be. It will be a voice traveling forward through time without its owner. That's not a ghost. That's technology. And somehow, that feels stranger. There is another thing that makes Dolly's story different from Tupac, Sidhu Moose Wala, or Juice WRLD. Those artists left behind lyrics that people later interpreted as predictions. Dolly left something more deliberate, a literal message intended for a future audience. She knew people might hear her after her death. She planned for it. She prepared for it. She accepted that someday she would become a voice preserved in recordings. And maybe that was one of the reasons she was never particularly afraid of talking about death. She understood legacy differently. To Dolly, death didn't necessarily mean disappearing. It meant leaving something behind. Songs, stories, but memories, a voice. And that is exactly what happened. Dolly is gone, but the work isn't. Her old interviews are still online. Her songs are still being played. Her unpublished recordings still exist. The song in the locked box still exists. The plans she made for her music after death still exist. Even the joke she made decades ago still exists. And now every one of those things contains information the original audience didn't have. That's what makes the old interview so unsettling. Listen to it now. Dolly says she never wants to retire. She says she hopes to keep working. Then she talks about falling dead while singing. And everybody around her laughs. But we know something they didn't know. We know there really was going to be a last day. There really was going to be a final song. There really was going to be a last interview. There really was going to be a last plan. And none of us gets to know which moment is which until afterward. That's the part that makes this story frightening. Dolly didn't predict her death. She didn't leave behind a supernatural warning. She simply understood that death was coming someday and spent much of her life making sure her work could continue when she couldn't. And on August 25th, 2026, the future she had spent decades imagining finally arrived. She was 80 years old. She had plans. She had unfinished work. She had things she still wanted to accomplish. And then there was no tomorrow for her, but there was something she had prepared for. A recording made years earlier. A song locked inside a box. A voice waiting for a future she would never see. And when that box is finally opened in 2046, the most disturbing thing about it may not be what Dolly says. It may simply be the sound of her voice, because for a few minutes she will be speaking from the past to people living in a future without her. And she will sound completely alive. On the night Tupac Shakur was shot, there was a strange detail that people would only fully appreciate years later. He had spent much of his career talking about death. Not once, not occasionally. It was everywhere. In his lyrics, in his interviews, in the way he talked about enemies, in the way he described violence, and even in the nightmares he said he was having after surviving an earlier shooting. By the summer of 1996, Tupac was 25 years old and one of the biggest musicians in the world. He also believed people wanted him dead. The unsettling part is that he had a reason to believe it, because almost 2 years earlier, someone had already tried. On November 30th, 1994, Tupac entered Quad Recording Studios in Manhattan. He expected to record. Instead, he was robbed and shot 5 times. He survived. But according to Tupac, the shooting changed him. He became convinced that people close to him had betrayed him. His suspicion focused partly on people connected to the East Coast rap scene, including the artists and associates around the notorious B.I.G. The shooting became one of the events that helped ignite the bitter East Coast-West Coast conflict that surrounded hip-hop in the mid-1990s. And Tupac didn't simply talk about the shooting as something that had happened to him, he carried it. While incarcerated at Rikers Island in 1995, he gave Vibe magazine an interview that now sounds almost impossible to hear without thinking about what eventually happened. He described nightmares. He said he had been having dreams in which people were still shooting him. He was 24 years old. He had survived being shot 5 times. And he was sitting in prison talking about the possibility that violence might eventually catch up with him again. At the time, it was not prophecy. It was trauma. And that distinction matters. Tupac wasn't seeing the future. He was describing the world he already lived in. But then something changed. When he was released from prison, he became even more involved in the violent image surrounding him. He signed with Death Row Records. He became closely associated with Marion Suge Schnitt. He began recording at an astonishing pace. And his music became increasingly aggressive. In his songs, Tupac talked constantly about enemies, surveillance, people putting prices on his head, and the possibility of being killed. On Ambition's Azarida, the opening track of All Eyes on Me, he rapped about preferring death to being captured. Those words were released while Tupac was alive, successful and apparently determined to make the most of the freedom he had regained. But the album also contained a darker pattern. The closer you listen, the more often death appears. Sometimes as a threat, sometimes as fear, sometimes as something he almost seemed to expect. This is where people later began asking a strange question. Was Tupac predicting his own death? Maybe he knew something. Maybe he felt someone was coming for him. Maybe his music contained clues. But there is another possibility. Maybe Tupac simply understood how dangerous his situation had become. Because the violence wasn't fictional, his first shooting had been real. His legal problems were real. His conflicts were real. The threats were real, and the people around him were increasingly connected to real street violence. By September 1996, Tupac was living inside an environment where a confrontation could turn deadly in seconds. Then came the night that changed everything. September 7th, 1996, Las Vegas. Tupac was there with Suge Knight to watch Mike Tyson fight Bruce Seldon at the MGM Grand. Tyson won quickly. After the fight, Tupac and members of his entourage became involved in a physical confrontation inside the casino with Orlando Anderson, a member of the Southside Compton Crips. Anderson was the nephew of Dwayne "Cafe D" Davis. That confrontation would later become one of the central pieces of the murder investigation. Tupac and Suge Knight eventually left the MGM Grand. Tupac was riding in a black BMW. Knight was driving. The night should have continued normally. Instead, someone in a white Cadillac pulled alongside them near the Las Vegas Strip. Gunshots erupted. Tupac was struck 4 times. Knight was also injured, but survived. Tupac was taken to the hospital. He was still alive. For 6 days, doctors tried to keep him alive. For 6 days, there was still a possibility that the story would end differently. It didn't. On September 13th, 1996, Tupac Shakur died from his injuries. He was 25 years old. The rapper who had spent years writing about death was suddenly gone, and immediately, people started going backward. They listened to the songs again. They watched old interviews. They searched through everything Tupac had said, and one thing kept appearing. He had been talking about death for years. But there is something important about that. It is easy to hear a lyric after someone's death and call it a prediction. It's much harder to remember that artists often write about the things that already frighten them. Tupac's music reflected his environment. He knew he could be killed. He had already been shot. He had already experienced betrayal. He knew that people around him were carrying weapons. He knew there were serious conflicts between death row and their rivals. So when he wrote about dying, he wasn't necessarily describing something imaginary. He was describing a possibility that already existed. And then, after his death, the possibility became reality. That is what makes the story so disturbing. But there is another detail that makes it even stranger. Tupac's final days were not spent hiding from danger. He was still moving through public places. He was still traveling. He was still surrounded by people. He was still involved in the kind of confrontational environment that had made him famous. And on the night of the shooting, he had just been involved in an actual physical fight. That fight allegedly became the motive for the attack. Almost 3 decades later, that version of events is still being argued in court. In 2023, police arrested Dwayne Davis, a former gang leader who had publicly described his involvement in the shooting. Davis had said that he was riding in the white Cadillac that night and had handed the gun to one of the men in the back seat. He did not claim to have pulled the trigger. 3 other men who were in the Cadillac have since died. In August 2026, Davis went to trial in Las Vegas, accused of orchestrating Tupac's murder. He pleaded not guilty. Prosecutors say he helped organize the attack as revenge for the earlier confrontation at the MGM Grand. His defense argues that Davis's old statements were exaggerated stories designed to generate publicity and sell his memoir. And now, almost 30 years after Tupac's death, a courtroom is finally forcing people to look at that night again. But the mystery surrounding Tupac isn't only about who killed him, it's also about why he seems so obsessed with dying. Because once you know the ending, some of his old interviews become difficult to hear. You hear a 24-year-old man sitting in prison. He talks about being shot. He talks about nightmares. He talks about people coming after him. He talks about the feeling that violence is following him. Then, less than a year later, he is sitting in a car in Las Vegas after a boxing match. A white Cadillac appears. Gunshots. And the man who spent so much of his career talking about death is fighting for his life. There is one particularly uncomfortable way to look at it. Maybe Tupac wasn't predicting anything. Maybe he was documenting the danger around him so accurately that, after his death, the music felt prophetic. That's not supernatural. It's actually more frightening, because it means the warning was already visible. The danger wasn't hidden. It was in the streets. It was in the rivalries. It was in the weapons. It was in the threats. It was in the confrontation that took place only hours before he was shot. And it was in Tupac's own words. He told people how afraid he was. He told people what violence had done to him. Then he turned that fear into music. Millions of people listened, but nobody could hear the future. They could only hear a young man describing the world he was living in, and perhaps that's why the old recordings feel so eerie today. Nothing about the recordings changed. Tupac's voice still sounds exactly the same. The confidence is still there. The anger is still there. The laughter is still there. The music still plays. But we know something the people listening in 1995 and 1996 didn't know. They were listening to someone who had less than a year left to live. Imagine hearing one of those songs for the first time without knowing anything about Tupac. You might hear the violence and think it was part of the character. Then you learn that he had already survived being shot. Then you learn that he was having nightmares about being shot again. Then you learn that he was surrounded by real enemies and real conflicts. Then you learn that he was murdered at 25. And suddenly, the lyrics don't feel like entertainment anymore. They feel like a diary. That doesn't mean every line was a prediction. It means the person writing them was living dangerously enough that death was already part of his daily thinking. And perhaps the most haunting part is that Tupac himself seemed to understand how fragile everything was. He had watched friendships collapse. He had watched people betray each other. He had survived an attempt on his life. He had spent time in prison. He had become famous at an age when most people were still trying to figure out who they were. And somehow, through all of it, he kept recording, kept performing, kept writing, kept moving. Until one night in Las Vegas, the danger he had spent years writing about finally became real. A car pulled alongside his. A gun appeared. 4 bullets entered his body. 6 days later, he was dead, 25 years old. Nearly 30 years have passed since then. Yet Tupac's voice is still everywhere. The songs are still playing. The interviews are still online. The words he spoke in that prison interview are still there. And there is something almost disturbing about watching that footage now. Because the young man on the screen doesn't know the ending. He doesn't know that he has less than a year. He doesn't know that a night in Las Vegas will become one of the most famous unsolved murder stories in music history. He doesn't know that people decades later will still be arguing about who killed him. And he certainly doesn't know that his old words about death will eventually make millions of people wonder whether he somehow saw it coming. Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't. There is no reliable evidence that Tupac knew the exact way he would die. But there is something we do know. He had already survived being shot. He was afraid of being shot again. He wrote constantly about death. He lived inside an increasingly violent conflict, and then he was killed in a drive-by shooting. Sometimes the most disturbing story isn't about someone predicting the future. It's about someone describing the danger around them so clearly and realizing too late that they were describing their own ending. There is something deeply unsettling about David Bowie's final music, not because he predicted his death, because he knew he was dying, and almost nobody listening to him knew. On January 8, 2016, David Bowie released an album called Black Star. It was his 69th birthday. 2 days later, he was dead. At first, the public thought they had been given another mysterious David Bowie record. They had no idea they were listening to a dying man say goodbye. That is what makes this story different. With Tupac, or Sidhu Moose Wala, people later searched old songs for clues and wondered whether the artist somehow knew what was coming. With Bowie, there was no need to wonder. Bowie knew. He had been diagnosed with cancer roughly 18 months earlier. He kept the illness private. He continued creating. And during the final months of his life, he made some of the strangest and darkest music of his entire career. The frightening part is that he hid the real meaning in plain sight. People were looking directly at the clues. They just didn't know what they were looking at. By the time Bowie began working on Black Star, he had already spent decades reinventing himself. He had been Ziggy Stardust, the Thin White Duke, Major Tom, a rock star, an actor, a cultural icon. He had always been fascinated by identity, death, isolation, transformation, and the possibility of becoming someone else. So, when Bowie returned to the studio in the 2015 period and started making unusual music with jazz musicians from New York, nobody immediately thought something was wrong. In fact, there was a deliberate effort to keep everything secret. Bowie and longtime producer Tony Visconti wanted the work protected from outside attention. Bowie had returned to music quietly with The Next Day after nearly a decade away from releasing a new album. That album had been a surprise, but Black Star was something else entirely. The sessions included Donny McCaslin's jazz quartet, and Bowie pushed the musicians into territory that was unfamiliar even by his standards. The songs were strange, long, heavy, uncomfortable. They didn't sound like a traditional farewell. They sounded like an artist experimenting, and that's exactly what most people thought was happening. Nobody knew that Bowie was fighting terminal cancer. According to the official Bowie archive, Black Star was released on his 69th birthday, January 8, 2016. Its first song was Black Star, then came Lazarus. That second title should eventually become one of the most haunting details in the entire story, Lazarus, a biblical figure associated with death and resurrection. The song had already been written for Bowie's stage production, Lazarus, which opened in New York in December 2015. It was not originally created as a secret confession. That matters. People sometimes tell this story as if Bowie deliberately named everything around his death and left clues everywhere. Reality is more complicated, but then you watch the video. Bowie is lying in what appears to be a hospital bed. There are bandages over his eyes. He reaches forward. He looks vulnerable. He looks trapped. And at one point, he sings words about looking upward toward heaven. At the time, the video was simply another unsettling piece of Bowie art. After his death, viewers watched it differently. The image of Bowie in a bed suddenly became impossible to separate from the cancer he had been hiding. The blindfold looked symbolic. The references to heaven sounded different. The idea of disappearing became much harder to dismiss. But there was something else happening behind the scenes. Bowie was running out of time. The people closest to him knew how serious the illness was. The public didn't. And Bowie kept working. That fact is almost harder to understand than the music. Imagine being told you have terminal cancer. Imagine knowing that the doctors can't simply make the problem disappear. Then imagine deciding that instead of retreating from the world, you're going to walk into a recording studio and make one final album. Not a greatest hits album. Not a collection of old material. New music. Risky music. Experimental music. Music nobody had heard before. That was Bowie. He was still creating. The sessions for Black Star were remarkably concentrated. According to the official David Bowie archive, the musicians recorded each track in extremely short sessions, with the album created using a live jazz ensemble. There was urgency. Not necessarily panic, urgency. Bowie knew he had limited time, and he had already started thinking about what he wanted to leave behind. One of the most important people beside him during those sessions was Tony Visconti. They had worked together for decades. Visconti understood Bowie better than most people in the recording world. He understood when Bowie was taking a musical risk. He understood when Bowie was hiding something, and later, Visconti would describe Black Star as Bowie's farewell. That wasn't merely a fan theory. Bowie was consciously creating his final statement. But the public didn't know the statement was final. That's the difference. On December 18, 2015, Bowie released Lazarus as a single. 3 weeks later, Black Star arrived. The reception was enormous. Critics praised the album. Fans analyzed it. People argued about what it meant. Nobody was talking about his imminent death because almost nobody knew he was dying. Imagine being one of those fans. You buy the album on release day. You put it on. You hear the strange opening. You listen to Black Star, then Lazarus. You reach the final songs. You think Bowie is being cryptic again. Maybe philosophical. Maybe theatrical. Maybe deliberately confusing. Then 2 days later, the news breaks. David Bowie has died. 69 years old. Cancer. Suddenly, the album has changed. Not musically. Contextually. Every song now sits under the shadow of something the listener didn't know when they first heard it. And then people start looking at the Lazarus video again, and again, and again. The hospital bed. The bandages. The strange room. Bowie's movements. The symbolism. The apparent struggle. Suddenly, what looked like abstract art begins to resemble a person preparing for death. But there is a trap here. It is easy to look backward and assume every detail was designed as a literal message. It wasn't. Bowie was an artist who had spent his career using symbolism. He loved ambiguity. He deliberately created multiple interpretations. So the correct way to look at the video isn't, Bowie secretly told everyone exactly how he would die. The evidence doesn't support that. The real story is more powerful. Bowie used his final period of creativity to confront the reality of death without publicly announcing that he was dying. He turned his private situation into art. And then he released that art to the world. That is much stranger than a supernatural prediction. Because Bowie knew something the audience didn't. He knew that time was running out. They thought he was simply making another Bowie record. He knew it might be the last. There is another detail that becomes almost painful when you look at the chronology. Black Star was released on January 8th, Bowie's birthday. That means the world was celebrating his 69th birthday while he was secretly approaching the end of his life. Fans were posting birthday messages. Radio stations were playing his music. Journalists were reviewing the album. People were congratulating him. And Bowie was dying. 2 days later, January 10th, 2016, the announcement came. David Bowie had died peacefully, surrounded by his family after an 18-month battle with cancer. The timing shocked the world. The album had been out for 48 hours. People were still listening to it for the first time. And the artist was already gone. Then came the interpretations. Black Star was now treated like a farewell. Lazarus was treated like a goodbye. The final track, I Can't Give Everything Away, suddenly sounded like a statement about the things Bowie had chosen not to reveal. And there was something especially appropriate about that. Bowie had spent his whole career controlling what the public was allowed to see. His appearance, his identity, his characters, his private life, even his illness. He had spent 18 months fighting cancer without telling the world, and he managed to keep creating almost until the end. That secrecy wasn't accidental. It was part of the way Bowie lived. He didn't want the public watching him become sick. He wanted them to see the work. Not the disease, not the hospital, not the weakness, the work. So he gave them Black Star, and then he disappeared. There is something almost cinematic about the sequence. The album comes out. The birthday arrives. The critics celebrate. The fans listen, and then the artist dies. 2 days. That's all. 48 hours between the release of the final album and his death. The final work was already in the world before Bowie left it. He had completed his final statement. He had placed it in the hands of millions of strangers. And then he was gone. That is why Bowie is such a fascinating part of a story about musicians who seem to predict their deaths. He didn't predict it, he knew. And he chose what to do with that knowledge. He could have disappeared. He could have stopped. He could have spent the final months away from cameras, away from studios, and away from the public. Instead, he made art. And he hid the truth inside it. Not as a puzzle that people needed to solve. More like a letter whose meaning would only become obvious after it had already been delivered. That is what makes Lazarus so difficult to watch now. When Bowie sings about heaven, you know something he knows that the character on screen doesn't explain. When you see him lying in that bed, you know there was a real hospital somewhere behind the symbolism. When you hear the album, you know the person singing is dying. The music hasn't changed. Your knowledge has. And that's what turns art into something almost frightening. A recording preserves a moment. It freezes a person's voice before they disappear. You can play the same song 1,000 times. The singer never gets older. Their voice never changes. They are permanently trapped inside that recording at the moment they made it. That was true for Bowie. Except he deliberately created some of those final recordings while knowing he wouldn't have unlimited time. So now, when someone plays Black Star, they're hearing the voice of a man who knew the end was approaching. He didn't tell the world directly. He didn't need to. He put his final thoughts into music. Then he let everyone else hear them. There is no need to claim that Bowie had supernatural abilities. There is no evidence he saw the exact date of his death. There is no mysterious prophecy that needs to be uncovered. The facts are already disturbing enough. He had cancer. He kept it private. He recorded a final album. He released it on his 69th birthday. The album contained Lazarus, a song accompanied by imagery of illness, confinement, and death. Then, 2 days later, David Bowie died. And perhaps the most haunting detail of all is that millions of people had already heard his goodbye. They just didn't realize it was a goodbye. They thought it was another David Bowie album. They thought there would be another one. Another tour. Another interview. Another strange video. Another reinvention. But there wasn't. There was Black Star. And then there was silence. So when people say David Bowie predicted his death, I think the truth is actually more unsettling. He didn't predict it. He knew death was coming. And instead of telling the world how afraid he was, he turned the final stretch of his life into art. Then he released it. And 2 days later, the world finally understood what it had been listening to. The last album wasn't a prediction. It was a farewell. The frightening part is that when Bowie said goodbye, nobody knew they were being told goodbye. There's a video of Avicii that becomes much harder to watch once you know how the story ends. He is sitting there talking calmly. No dramatic music. No horror soundtrack. No mysterious voiceover telling you that something terrible is about to happen. Just Tim Bergling, the Swedish musician known around the world as Avicii, explaining that he was exhausted. He was talking about touring, about anxiety, about his health, about people continuing to ask him to perform when he already believed he couldn't keep doing it. Then he said something that would later become one of the most disturbing things ever recorded about him. He said, "I'm going to die." He didn't say it once. He said he had said it many times. The documentary containing those words was released in 2017. On April 20th, 2018, Avicii was found dead in Muscat, Oman. He was 28 years old. And suddenly, the video everybody had watched as a documentary about a superstar's struggle became something much darker. Because Avicii hadn't been predicting some random event. He had been warning people that the life he was living was becoming dangerous. The warning had been recorded. His own voice was on camera, and everyone could hear it after he was gone. Tim Bergling had become famous incredibly quickly. He started making electronic music as a teenager, largely from his bedroom. Then his tracks began spreading online. Eventually, the name Avicii became attached to enormous songs, enormous festivals, and a level of fame that few electronic musicians had ever reached. Levels turned him into a global star. Then came songs like "Wake Me Up," "Hey Brother," and "Waiting for Love." His music crossed boundaries. People who didn't normally listen to electronic dance music knew his songs, but there was another side of the success that wasn't visible in the music videos. The touring never seemed to stop. He was young. He was traveling constantly. He was performing in city after city. And his body eventually began to break down. By 2012, Avicii had already suffered acute pancreatitis. He was still incredibly young. The health problems continued. In 2014, he underwent surgery to remove his appendix and gallbladder. He also experienced further health problems connected to years of heavy drinking. Despite all of that, the performances continued. At one point, the schedule became so intense that Avicii reportedly performed hundreds of shows in a single year. In the documentary Avicii: True Stories, the filmmakers followed him over several years and captured just how badly the touring lifestyle was affecting him. The footage wasn't presented as a horror story. It was supposed to show the reality behind the superstar. But watching it after his death creates a completely different experience. You see a young man surrounded by people. You see enormous crowds waiting for him. You see managers, business decisions, flights, schedules and contracts, and you see Avicii trying to explain that his body and mind are reaching their limit. One of the most important moments comes when he discusses his decision to stop performing live. He says that he had been very open about his anxiety and his health. He says people had seen how ill he felt, and yet he describes getting pushback when he tried to stop. Then he says the sentence, "I have said, like, I'm going to die." He explains that he had said it repeatedly. And then he makes something very clear. He doesn't want anyone telling him he should consider doing another show. That footage was recorded before his death. The documentary was released in October 2017. At the time, viewers could interpret the statement exactly as Avicii intended it. He was saying that touring was becoming unbearable. He was saying his health was deteriorating. He was frightened by what might happen if he continued. He wasn't telling people that he had some supernatural vision of April 20th. He was describing what he genuinely believed would happen if nothing changed. And eventually, something did change. In March 2016, Avicii announced that he was retiring from touring. He was only 26. That's an extraordinary decision for an artist at the peak of his career. Most musicians spend their entire lives trying to reach the position Avicii had reached. He already had the festivals, the money, the fame, the international audience, and he was walking away from the stage. His statement explained that the decision was about his personal life and his health. He wanted a life beyond the constant cycle of airports, hotel rooms, rehearsals, and performances. He said he had to make a change for his own well-being, but retiring from touring didn't mean Avicii stopped making music. That part is easy to misunderstand. He didn't quit music. He quit the road. He wanted to continue creating in the studio. And for a while, it seemed like the plan might work. He could finally wake up without another flight waiting. He could make music because he wanted to. He could spend time away from enormous crowds. He could try to build an ordinary life around the extraordinary career he had already created. But leaving touring didn't erase everything he had already been through. The anxiety was still there. The health problems were still part of his history. And the pressure of being Avicii didn't simply disappear because he stopped performing. His fans still wanted music. The industry still wanted Avicii. There were still expectations. There was still the question of what came next. In 2017, he released Avicii, an EP that showed he was still actively making music. He was not disappearing. In fact, he seemed determined to continue creating. That makes the documentary even more important, because the person on screen wasn't saying, "I don't want to make music anymore." He was saying, "I don't want to die because of the way this career is being lived." There's a big difference. And that difference is where the tragedy begins to take shape. Avicii wanted music. He didn't necessarily want the machine surrounding the music. His family later described him as an overachieving perfectionist, a sensitive person who traveled and worked at a pace that led to extreme stress. They said that when he stopped touring, he wanted to find balance and do what he loved most, music. They also said he struggled deeply with questions about meaning, life, and happiness. Those statements changed the way people looked at the documentary. Suddenly, the words were no longer part of a celebrity profile. They were evidence of a young man trying to explain that something inside his life had become unsustainable. Then came April 2018. Avicii traveled to Oman. He was 28. According to reporting at the time, he was staying in Muscat and spending time with friends. There was no public indication that anything catastrophic was about to happen. On April 20th, he was found dead. His publicist announced the death that afternoon. The world learned that Tim Bergling was gone. At first, the details were uncertain. His family asked for privacy. There were conflicting rumors. News organizations reported that authorities had conducted autopsies and found no criminal suspicion in his death. abc.net.awe. People wanted answers. They wanted to know what had happened to a 28-year-old whose music had seemed so full of life. Then his family released another statement. It was deeply painful. They described Tim as someone who had been searching for meaning, someone sensitive, someone who had struggled. They said he had worked too hard and suffered extreme stress, and then they said that when he stopped touring, he had been trying to find balance. They described him as someone who wanted peace. The statement was widely understood as indicating that his death had been suicide. The family did not provide graphic details, and they asked for privacy. That made the documentary footage even harder to watch. Because there was no longer any need to ask whether he had been struggling. He had told people. He had shown people. His friends had seen it. His family knew he was struggling. His audience could now watch the evidence themselves. And that sentence kept coming back. I'm going to die. It sounds like a prediction when you hear it after someone's death. But that isn't what it was. He was warning the people around him about the consequences of forcing himself to continue. And that distinction may actually make the story more frightening, because a supernatural prediction gives people an excuse. You can tell yourself nobody could have done anything. A prophecy is unavoidable. A warning is different. A warning means someone was telling you there was danger. Avicii was telling them. He wanted to stop. He had already experienced serious medical problems. He had already suffered from anxiety. He had already pushed himself through years of touring. He had already decided that the lifestyle was hurting him badly enough to leave the stage. And he still carried the psychological damage that came with everything he had experienced. The documentary captured the conflict. Part of Avicii wanted to create. Another part of him wanted to escape the machine surrounding his success. And that machine had become enormous. There were thousands of fans. There were promoters. There were contracts. There were expectations. There was an entire industry built around his ability to keep showing up. But the person behind the name was still Tim Bergling, a young man who had started making music in his bedroom. A young man who had never seemed completely comfortable with the celebrity machine surrounding him, and eventually, he reached the point where he could no longer keep pretending it was sustainable. That's why one of the saddest details about his story is that retiring from touring was not a failure. It was probably one of the healthiest decisions he had made. He was trying to save himself. He wanted to make music without destroying himself. He wanted a life that belonged to Tim, not just Avicii, and for a while it seemed possible. He still released music. He still collaborated with other artists. He still worked in the studio. He still had plans. But the problems inside him didn't disappear simply because the touring ended, and that is something people sometimes miss when they tell this story. They say Avicii predicted his death because he said he was going to die. That makes the story sound mysterious. The reality is sadder. He was struggling in front of people. He was trying to communicate it, and he was doing everything he could to change the circumstances that were making him suffer. There is no evidence that he knew exactly when he would die. There is no evidence he predicted Oman. There is no evidence he knew that April 20th would become the final date of his life. He was trying to avoid an ending he feared. That is what makes his words so haunting. He wasn't welcoming death. He was trying to prevent it, and that changes the meaning of the documentary completely. Imagine watching the film for the first time in 2017. You see a young superstar. He is successful. He is surrounded by music. He is telling you he doesn't want to tour anymore. You might think he is simply burned out. You might think he'll recover. He's 26. He has time. He can take a break. He can figure things out. He can return when he's ready. Then you watch it again after April 2018. Now you know something the person on the screen doesn't know. He has less than a year left. Every sentence becomes heavier. Every pause feels different. When he says he won't be able to play anymore, you know he won't. When he talks about dying, you know he eventually will. When he says he wants to leave touring behind, you realize how desperately he was trying to find another way to live. There is something almost cruel about recorded footage. A camera can preserve a person's voice long after that person is gone. Avicii is still there in the documentary. Still young. Still talking. Still frustrated. Still trying to explain himself. He doesn't know the ending, but the viewer does. And that creates the strange feeling that the audience is watching something from the future. It's not a prediction. It's hindsight. And hindsight can be terrifying. The final irony is that Avicii's warning was not hidden in a song. It wasn't encoded in a music video. It wasn't buried in some obscure interview. He said it directly. He was going to die if he kept living that way. He repeated it. He tried to stop. He left the stage. But even after he escaped the touring schedule, the struggle inside him remained. On April 20th, 2018, Tim Bergling died in Muscat. He was 28. The music didn't stop. His songs continued playing. Wake Me Up continued filling stadiums. Levels continued appearing at parties. New generations discovered his music without ever having seen the person behind it. And after his death, his unfinished work eventually became part of his legacy. An album titled Tim was released posthumously in 2019, built from recordings he had been working on before his death. His voice continued. His music continued. The career continued. Only Tim couldn't. That's the part I keep coming back to. Avicii once said he was going to die. People can call that a prediction. But it wasn't. It was a warning. A young man was telling the people around him that he was breaking. He was telling them the pace was destroying him. He was asking to stop, and for a while, he actually did. But sometimes escaping the situation that hurts you isn't enough to erase what it has already done. That's why the old documentary feels so disturbing now. The camera captured a warning before the audience knew it was one. Avicii wasn't looking into the future. He was looking at the life he was living, and he was afraid of where it was taking him. He was right to be afraid. The terrifying part isn't that he somehow knew the date of his death. It's that he knew something was seriously wrong, said it out loud, and the recording survived him. The title of the song was The Last Ride. 2 weeks after Sidhu Moose Wala released it, he was murdered while sitting inside his car. That fact alone would have been disturbing enough. But then people listened to the song again. They looked at the cover. They read the lyrics. They remembered who the song was about. And suddenly, something that had sounded like a tribute began to feel like a warning. Sidhu Moose Wala was 28 years old when he died. He was one of the biggest Punjabi singers in the world, known for songs that mixed traditional Punjabi music with hip-hop, street imagery, fame, guns, rivalries, and death. He had millions of listeners. He had political ambitions. He had enemies. And he had already experienced threats. But nobody listening to The Last Ride on the day it came out could have known that the title would soon become almost impossible to hear normally. Because on May 29th, 2022, Sidhu Moose Wala went for a drive. He never came home. The story begins with a picture. The cover of The Last Ride showed a car. Not just any car. It was connected to Tupac Shakur. Sidhu had admired Tupac enormously, and the song was widely understood as a tribute to the murdered American rapper. Tupac had also been 25 when he was killed in a drive-by shooting in Las Vegas. The parallels were already there. A young musician. Massive popularity. A public image built around strength and danger. A fascination with Tupac, and a song centered on a final ride. At first, it was simply art. Sidhu was known for using real-life themes in his music. His songs were often about status, loyalty, violence, enemies, and the risks of becoming powerful in an environment where rivalries could become dangerous. That was part of his identity as an artist. People weren't shocked when he released The Last Ride. They listened to it. They shared it. They debated the lyrics. Then 2 weeks passed. On May 29th, Sidhu left his home in Mansa district, Punjab. He was driving a black Mahindra Thar. 2 other people were traveling with him. He was not in a heavily protected convoy. That detail would become extremely important. Only a day earlier, the Punjab government had reduced security cover for hundreds of people, including Sidhu Moose Wala, as part of a broader effort to reduce VIP protection. He had previously traveled with security personnel. Now he was more exposed. According to police and later reporting, the reduction had taken effect the day before the murder. Sidhu apparently wasn't expecting anything unusual. He got into his Thar. He started driving. And somewhere along the road, several vehicles began following him. What happened next lasted only seconds. A group of attackers reportedly intercepted his vehicle. Then the shooting started. Dozens of rounds were fired. Sidhu was struck repeatedly. He was 28 years old. The singer, whose latest release was called The Last Ride, had been killed during a ride. And that's when people began going backward. They opened YouTube. They played the song again. They looked at the title. They looked at the cover. They listened to the lyrics. And one line in particular began circulating. The lyric was interpreted as saying that the person's face revealed he would die young. When people heard those words after Sidhu's murder, they didn't sound like ordinary lyrics anymore. They sounded prophetic. But there is something important to understand. We cannot honestly say Sidhu predicted his murder. There is no reliable evidence that he knew exactly when or how he would die. The song had been released as a tribute to Tupac. Its themes came from the world Sidhu had already been writing about. Death wasn't a new subject. Violence wasn't a new subject. Street conflict wasn't a new subject. He had been writing about those things for years. And that is what makes the story more disturbing. Because his music wasn't fantasy, it was heavily connected to the environment around him. Sidhu was a controversial figure. He had been involved in political activity. He had made enemies. His name had appeared in disputes involving rival groups. Police investigations following his death pointed toward an organized criminal network, and the murder became part of a much larger rivalry involving gang figures. So when he released a song about death, he wasn't writing from a safe distance. He was already living in the middle of the culture he was describing. Then something else happened. Fans noticed the date. Sidhu died on May 29th. Another famous Sidhu song was titled 295. People immediately began connecting the numbers. 295. May 29th. The coincidence spread across social media. People began posting screenshots. They made videos. They built theories. Some claimed Sidhu had somehow encoded the date of his death. But again, there was no evidence of that. The song 295 had an entirely different context and had been released before his death. There was no reliable indication that Sidhu was secretly announcing May 29th. It was a coincidence. A disturbing one, but still a coincidence. And the same thing happened with The Last Ride. The song was released on May 15th, 2022. Sidhu was killed on May 29th. 14 days. That's the part that makes the story difficult to dismiss emotionally, even if there is no supernatural explanation. 14 days between the song and the murder. 14 days between a title about a final ride and an actual final ride. And then there was the Tupac connection. Tupac had died in a shooting while riding in a car. Sidhu had admired him. Sidhu released a song built around that imagery. Then Sidhu himself was shot while riding in a car. The similarities were almost too perfect. But the real story behind the similarities is darker than coincidence. Sidhu's own life had placed him in dangerous circumstances. His success made him enormously influential. His songs openly discussed violence. He was involved in political life. His name was connected with conflicts between gangs. He was a public figure in an environment where criminal organizations and celebrity culture sometimes overlapped. And then, just before his death, his government security was reduced. That is a factual part of the timeline. It was not a hidden clue. It was not a mysterious prediction. It was a real-world change that left him more vulnerable. On the afternoon of his death, Sidhu was heading toward his aunt's home. According to reports, he had been planning to visit her. He was not driving a special armored vehicle. He was not surrounded by a large security detail. He was simply traveling. Then the attackers appeared. The attack was fast, extremely violent. And afterward, one of India's biggest music stars was gone. The investigators moved quickly. The Bishnoi gang and its associates became central to the investigation. Goldie Brar, a Canadian-based gang figure associated with Lawrence Bishnoi, claimed responsibility for the murder in a Facebook post. Police later arrested multiple suspects in connection with the killing. The motive was investigated as part of a wider criminal rivalry. Again, none of this suggested anything supernatural. It suggested something far more ordinary. Sidhu had become involved, voluntarily or otherwise, in a world where real people could organize real violence. His fame couldn't protect him completely. His songs couldn't protect him. His supporters couldn't protect him. And on that afternoon, neither could his vehicle. But there is another reason. The last ride became so disturbing. Sidhu had been thinking about legacy. He was no longer simply a singer. He had become an enormous cultural figure. His songs were being listened to across the world. His image was everywhere. His influence had moved beyond music. And like Tupac, he had created an identity around surviving danger. That identity became part of his brand. The problem is that an image of danger can eventually become very difficult to separate from actual danger. When you constantly write about enemies, violence, and death, audiences may see it as entertainment. But the people around you might not. And when real enemies exist, the line between music and reality becomes dangerously thin. That's why The Last Ride is so uncomfortable to listen to now. The song itself did not cause the murder. The lyrics did not magically predict it. But they documented a world where death was already part of the conversation. Then, 14 days later, death became the story. There is also something haunting about how young Sidhu was. 28, old enough to have achieved what most musicians never will. Young enough to believe there was still decades ahead. He had more music to make. More performances, more projects, more political ambitions, more songs. And then everything ended on a rural road, not in a concert, not on a stage, not surrounded by thousands of fans, inside a vehicle, during what should have been an ordinary trip. That is why people couldn't stop replaying The Last Ride. The song now carries information nobody could have known when it was released. The listener knows what comes next. Sidhu didn't. At least there is no evidence he did. He released the song. He continued living. He continued working. He continued appearing in public. Then he was murdered. And now every lyric has the advantage of hindsight. That is what makes hindsight so dangerous. After a tragedy, people connect details that didn't necessarily belong together before it happened. A title becomes a clue. A lyric becomes a warning. A date becomes a code. A photograph becomes evidence. A coincidence becomes a prediction. Sometimes those connections reveal something real. Sometimes they reveal nothing more than our need to find meaning in something that was never supposed to make sense. But there is one thing that cannot be explained away as coincidence. Sidhu's final ride really happened. The song really existed. The title really was The Last Ride. The song really was released only weeks before he was killed, and the circumstances of his murder really did involve a vehicle, gunmen, and an attack that lasted only moments. Those are the facts. Everything beyond them belongs to interpretation. Maybe Sidhu had no idea what was coming. Maybe he simply used Tupac's death as a metaphor because he admired him. Maybe the line about dying young was just another dramatic image in a song filled with them. And maybe the timing was nothing more than a terrible coincidence. But imagine hearing that song without knowing any of this. You hear the title. You hear a young man singing about death. You see the image. You move on to the next song. Nothing seems unusual. Then someone tells you what happened 2 weeks later. You hear it again. Now every second feels different. That's the strange power of hindsight. The song didn't change. The singer didn't change. The words didn't change. Only the ending did. Sidhu Moose Wala died on May 29, 2022. He was 28 years old. And the song he had released 14 days earlier was still called The Last Ride. Maybe that's all it was. A title. A tribute. A coincidence. Or maybe there was something about the world Sidhu was living in that he understood better than the people listening to his music ever could. Because the most frightening possibility isn't that he saw the future. It's that he was describing his present, and his present was already dangerous enough to become his ending. There is a song by Juice WRLD that people heard completely differently after he died. Before his death, it was a song about grief. After his death, it sounded like a warning. The song was called Legends, and in it, Juice WRLD asked a question that would become horrifyingly specific. He asked what the 27 Club was. Then he said they weren't making it past 21. At the time, he was 18 years old. He wasn't saying he would definitely die at 21. The song was written after the deaths of Lil Peep and XXXTentacion, two young artists whose deaths had deeply affected him. Juice was grieving. He was afraid. He was trying to understand why so many young musicians were dying. Then, less than 2 years later, he died at 21. December 8th, 2019. Chicago, Midway Airport. A private plane, a seizure. And suddenly, that old song became one of the most unsettling pieces of music in his catalog. People began asking the same question they had asked about Tupac and Sidhu Moose Wala. Did Juice WRLD somehow know? The answer isn't as simple as people make it sound. There is no reliable evidence that he knew the date of his death, but there is something documented that makes his story extremely difficult to forget. He repeatedly talked about death. He repeatedly talked about drugs. He repeatedly talked about addiction, and he repeatedly wrote about dying young. The danger wasn't hidden. It was one of the biggest subjects in his music. Jarad Anthony Higgins, known professionally as Juice WRLD, grew up in Illinois and became one of the biggest young artists of his generation almost overnight. His breakthrough came through music released online. Songs like Lucid Dreams turned him into a superstar. By the time his debut album arrived, he had already built an enormous following. But unlike many artists who carefully separated their public image from their private problems, Juice put much of his personal life directly into the music. Depression, anxiety, heartbreak, drugs, addiction, death. His songs often sounded like someone thinking out loud. Sometimes they were confident, sometimes chaotic, sometimes strangely honest, and sometimes they sounded like someone who was scared of himself. That is why Legends stands out. The song wasn't written as a prediction. It was a reaction. Lil Peep had died from an accidental drug overdose in November 2017. Then, XXXTentacion was murdered in June 2018. Juice WRLD was devastated by both. He recorded Legends as part of Too Soon, a project dedicated to the two artists. The song wasn't celebrating death. It was asking why young artists kept disappearing. And then came the line. He mentioned the so-called 27 Club, the informal label associated with famous musicians who died at 27. But he wasn't 27. He was talking about the artists around him. Then he said they weren't making it past 21. That line didn't immediately seem like a prophecy. Juice was 18 when he recorded it. 3 years seemed like an enormous amount of time. He could have lived to 80. He could have forgotten the line himself. It could have remained nothing more than a sad lyric written during a terrible period. Then Juice WRLD turned 20. His career became even bigger. Death Race for Love was released in 2019 and debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200. He was touring, recording, collaborating, making more music. To an outsider, he had everything. But behind the success, his relationship with drugs remained a serious concern. This is where his story becomes much harder to romanticize. Juice didn't simply write about drugs because it sounded dark. He openly discussed using them. His lyrics were filled with references to pills, codeine, lean, and addiction. The HBO documentary Juice WRLD, Into the Abyss, later showed just how deeply drugs had become intertwined with his life and creative process. The film contains footage of Juice discussing his own drug use and interviews with people close to him. He's surrounded by friends. They're laughing. They're traveling. They're recording music. People are talking about shows and upcoming projects. Then the subject of drugs comes up. And suddenly the whole atmosphere changes. You realize this isn't an artist pretending to be reckless. This was someone who really was struggling with substance use. His music had been telling the truth. The problem was that truth had become part of his lifestyle. There were warning signs before his death. Friends around him had concerns. Juice himself had written extensively about the possibility of dying. But he also appeared to believe he still had time. That is one of the cruelest parts of being young. You can know something is dangerous without believing the danger will happen today. You can take risks for years and wake up the next morning. You can tell yourself you'll stop later. You can believe you will get healthy eventually. Then one day, there isn't a later. On December 8, 2019, Juice WRLD returned to Chicago on a private aircraft. The plane was flying from Los Angeles to Chicago. There were other people with him. Federal law enforcement agents were waiting at Chicago's Midway Airport because they had information concerning possible weapons and drugs aboard the aircraft. When the plane landed, authorities searched it. During that process, Juice suffered a seizure. He was treated at the airport. Then he was taken to a hospital. The young musician who had spent years writing about death was suddenly fighting for his life. He was 21. The news spread quickly. At first, reports described a seizure. People didn't know whether he would survive. Then came the announcement. Jarad Anthony Higgins was dead. The exact cause wasn't immediately public. Rumors began spreading. Some people claimed he had swallowed a large number of pills because he was afraid authorities would find them. But later reporting and the documentary Into the Abyss challenged the simplified version of those events. The Cook County Medical Examiner eventually determined that Juice WRLD died from an accidental overdose involving oxycodone and codeine. Billboard.com. He was 21 years old. And suddenly, the lyric from Legends became impossible to ignore. He had said they weren't making it past 21. Now, he hadn't made it past 21. Fans played the song again. They shared the lyric. They made videos. News organizations reported on the coincidence. Some headlines openly described the lyric as a prediction. But there is an important detail that often gets lost. The song wasn't written about Juice himself dying at 21. It was written in response to the deaths of Lil Peep and XXXTentacion. Juice was mourning two artists. He was reflecting on a pattern of young musicians dying. He was afraid of that pattern. And ironically, he became part of it. That's what makes the song so disturbing. Not because there is proof he saw the future. There isn't. But because the thing he was afraid of eventually happened to him. And it happened at exactly the age he had mentioned. There was another recurring theme in Juice WRLD's music that makes his death even harder to separate from the songs. He talked about drugs constantly. Sometimes the lyrics sounded almost celebratory. Other times, they sounded terrified. He described being trapped. He described needing substances to cope. He described feeling like he was losing control. And people sometimes misunderstood that. They heard the music and assumed the drug references were simply part of the aesthetic. But the documentary footage shows a different picture. In Into the Abyss, the director Tommy Oliver included footage from Juice's life that presented him as a complicated young man dealing with enormous success, depression, and drug use. The film doesn't create a mystery around his death. It makes the tragedy more direct. He was struggling with addiction, and his death was connected to that struggle. TheGuardian.com. That is why I think the prediction angle actually misses the most frightening part. Imagine Juice writing Legends at 18. He is grieving. He has watched two young artists die. He's looking at a music industry where fame and tragedy seem connected. He asks, what is happening? He wonders why the legends keep dying. Then he says, they aren't making it past 21. Maybe, at the time, he thought it was simply an expression of fear. Maybe part of him was worried that the same thing could happen to him. Maybe he didn't take the line literally at all. We can't know, but less than 3 years later, he was dead at 21. That coincidence is impossible to undo. There's another thing that makes the final day especially eerie. Juice had just turned 21 on December 2nd. He had barely been 21 for a week. He was still a kid by any normal measure. His career was accelerating. His future seemed enormous. He had fans across the world. He had more music coming. He had more collaborations planned. He had a catalog that would eventually become one of the most important legacies of the SoundCloud generation. And yet, on December 8th, all of it stopped. The final hours have been reconstructed through reporting and later documentary interviews. After the plane landed, chaos erupted. Authorities were there. People were moving. There was confusion. Then Juice collapsed. A person who had spent so much time turning emotional pain into music was suddenly unconscious. The people around him were trying to save him. Emergency responders arrived. He was taken away. And somewhere between the plane and the hospital, the future that everyone assumed he had disappeared. He never recorded another normal studio album while alive. He never reached 22. He never saw how large his influence would become. He never saw millions of younger artists cite him as an influence. He never saw the posthumous projects. He never saw the songs he had recorded released without him. He never got to hear how differently his fans would interpret his old music. But they did, and Legends became the centerpiece. The title itself became haunting. Legends. He had been afraid of becoming one. He didn't want the title because, in his words, it seemed like legends kept dying. Then he became one, and he died at the exact age he had mentioned in the song. There is something tragic about that progression. The song was about other people. Then it became about him. The lyric wasn't rewritten. The meaning changed because the world changed. That's how these stories work. A song cannot predict the future, but tragedy can give old words a new meaning. And sometimes that new meaning feels frighteningly precise. There are other songs where Juice discussed death too. He repeatedly imagined his own funeral. He described being remembered. He talked about dying young. He sometimes spoke about whether he would live long enough to see certain things. Some fans later interpreted these as additional predictions. Again, we should be careful. An artist who constantly writes about death isn't necessarily predicting death. For Juice, death was tied directly to the themes he explored. Depression, addiction, fame, fear, loss. He was surrounded by all of them. When Lil Peep died, Juice reacted. When XXXTentacion was murdered, Juice reacted. He was watching his generation lose people, and then he became one of the people they lost. The most unsettling part may actually be something he said shortly before his death. On December 1st, 2019, just one day before his birthday, Juice posted a message encouraging people to live their lives and make a difference. He talked about changing the world. He talked about becoming bigger than his own image. He was preparing for the future. He was 20 years old. He expected there to be one. Then he turned 21. 6 days later, he was dead. There is no evidence that he knew the end was that close. There is no evidence that he knew he would die in Chicago. There is no evidence that he deliberately wrote an exact prophecy into Legends, but there is something we know for certain. He was afraid of dying young. He wrote about it. He wrote about drugs. He wrote about addiction. He wrote about losing control, and the thing he feared most eventually happened. That's why hearing Legends today feels different. The young voice in the recording doesn't sound like someone who knows he's about to die. He sounds confused. He sounds sad. He sounds like someone trying to understand why people his age keep disappearing. He doesn't know that, less than 2 years later, listeners will use his own words to talk about him. He doesn't know that he will become part of the exact history he is describing. He doesn't know that his age will become the most haunting detail of the song. He doesn't know that fans will someday hear the line about 21 and stop the song. Because now they know. He didn't make it past 21. And maybe that's the part of this story that should stay with you. Not the conspiracy theories. Not the idea that Juice WRLD magically predicted his death. The reality is darker. A young man was surrounded by people who had seen him struggle. His music openly described the substances he was using. He had already watched other young artists die. He wrote a song about the fear that young legends weren't surviving. Then, at 21, he died from the same kind of danger that had appeared repeatedly in his art. There was no secret code required. The warning was already in the music. It was in the lyrics. It was in the documentary footage. It was in the real-life people around him were witnessing. And perhaps that is why the final line of this story isn't really a question about whether Juice WRLD predicted his death. It's a question about whether anyone can hear a warning when it sounds like a song, because sometimes people tell you exactly what is happening to them. They just don't know that one day everyone will listen back and realize how serious it was. Juice WRLD died on December 8, 2019. He was 21. He had once written that they weren't making it past 21. At the time, it was a line about fear. Afterward, it became something else. A coincidence. A tragedy. A warning. Nobody can say exactly what it was. But every time that song plays now, there is one fact sitting inside it that wasn't there before. The singer who wrote about not making it past 21 didn't.